Welcome, everyone. I hope that you have been enjoying the 22nd annual ISOJ. Today is our last day of the conference, which is hard to believe. Before we get started with our workshop, I just want to share a few quick notes and also give a special thanks to the Knight Foundation and Google News Initiative for sponsoring this year's ISOJ. We wouldn't be able to do this without their support. And I want to remind everyone that this workshop will be simultaneously interpreted into Spanish, thanks to support from Univision Noticias. So if you're tuning in via Zoom, just click on that interpretation globe, select the Spanish channel, and you'll be able to listen to the Spanish interpretation. And if at any point you have any technical difficulties with Zoom, we are streaming this session to YouTube in both Spanish and English. And so we'll pop the YouTube links in the chat so that you can access them. And so now I'm really excited about today's workshop, which is going to focus on how to work toward a news ecosystem that cleanly separates news from opinion. And as we all know, this topic is increasingly important at a time when opinion and journalism are often mixed together on social media, making it difficult to differentiate between the two. So we'll look at how to separate out news from opinion and why that matters in terms of news consumption and our media ecosystem. So leading today's workshop will be Kate Harloe, a strategist and researcher at the News Quality Initiative, NewsQ, where she leads the project's review panels of journalists and scholars who study news quality online. So I'm happy to welcome Kate and our other workshop speakers who she will introduce. Without further ado, take it away, Kate.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to get us started today by introducing this workshop and our presenters. Thanks so much, Mallory. My name is Kate Harloe, and I'm a journalist and strategist at the News Quality Initiative, which is a project of the Knight Center for Entrepreneurial Journalism at the Craig Newmark School of Journalism and supported by Hacks Hackers. With me this morning is Connie Sehat, director of the News Quality Initiative, who will be helping to moderate the questions and the workshop. And here to present today is Subbu Vincent, Director for the Journalism and Media Ethics Program at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics, and Patricia Lopez, longtime journalist and editorial board member at the Star Tribune in Minnesota. So I'll start with a little background on why we're here today and go over what we're planning to do with this session, and then I'll hand it over to begin the presentation. So at the News Quality Initiative, our aim is to think about how to elevate quality news online. And we do that in a few different ways, one of which is through our review panels, which are groups of journalists, technologists, and academics who we convene to research and constructively engage on those questions. Last year, we welcomed our first cohort of panelists, which thought about this question through a number of different lenses. We had one panel focused on local news, one focused on science news, and one focused on opinion journalism. Subbu and Patricia were members of our inaugural opinion panel and lead authors on the panel's recommendations, which are published on our website, and we can drop that link in the chat today. Today, they're going to lead a 15-minute instructional presentation that overviews why opinion journalism matters to elevating quality news online, what some of the challenges are, and the panel's recommendations for how to meet those challenges. We want to acknowledge the contributions of the other wonderful panelists from last year who are also authors on those recommendations, which included David Agraz, who is an engineer at Google/YouTube, Leona Allen, who is deputy publisher at the Dallas Morning News, John Alsop, who is a columnist at the Columbia Journalism Review, Rochelle Riley, longtime columnist at the Detroit Free Press, and Rebecca Traister, who is a contributing writer at New York Magazine. One final note before we get started today is that the aim of this workshop is really to be as interactive as possible. We are, of course, a little bit limited by technology. This is a webinar, but we really want to encourage you to use that Q&A function. Our aim today is really to put forward the ideas of these journalists and to get as much feedback as possible to engage the audience and to have a conversation with you. So please don't hesitate to ask questions throughout the session. We'll be monitoring the chat during the presentation and after. we're going to reserve a significant amount of time later in the presentation to really engage with your questions, address them, and put them to the presenters. So in that vein, we are now going to start a quick poll to get a sense of the audience's views on some of the topics that we're going to cover today. So I will hold here a little time, about 10 or 20 seconds, for you to fill out the questions to this poll, and then I'll hand it over to Subbu. Great. Well, I hope that gives you a little bit of time to read through the questions and answer them. And now I'm going to hand things over to Subbu Vincent, who is going to kick off our instructional presentation.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for signing into this session today. It's just been awesome, and I want to thank ISOJ and all of the sponsors as well. We're going to talk about how to work towards an ecosystem that cleanly separates news and opinion. And we use the word ecosystem in a particular sense. I know the word is thrown around with a lot of gay abandon. We mean in the sense that news publishers are upstream of the platforms and the search platforms, as well as the social media platforms, and the public is downstream of the platforms when they discover news and experience news on the platforms. So there is an ecosystem and a supply chain that goes in that order. And when we say separate news and opinion, we mean that it's got to be separated, labeled for the whole ecosystem. If it's just the publishers, it doesn't work. If it's just the platforms without the publishers cooperating, that goes even worse. So it has to be the whole system in one sense. Just as an outline, we'll talk a little bit about the actual problem of distinguishing between news and opinion. We'll also go through some examples of what happens now when you're experiencing news articles on feeds on your. These could be on Apple News, it could be Facebook News, it could be Google News, it could be Twitter, and so on. So we'll show you some screenshots and what that actually means, and then I'll actually hand it off to Patricia, and she'll go over what we recommended in our inaugural opinion panel. And then we'll open it up for you folks. So just to clear up the terms itself, the word opinion is not the same as what we use in the news. Opinion itself, since you folks already know the classical term, it means a view, judgment formed about something, but it's not necessary that it's based on fact or knowledge. It can come out of value system. It can just come out of liking or disliking something. It can be a psychological feeling that drives an opinion. Opinion journalism, on the other hand, usually has an explicit point of view. It persuades people, informs, entertains, challenges. It's fact-based. The accuracy news value still applies. But most importantly, it's journalism itself. It's part of journalism. News publishers publish reportage as news. They also publish, opinions from experts, columnists, people with lived experience, journalists who've been covering an issue, for a long time. All of those folks come in through the opinion streams that come out of news publishers. And one key thing that connects information and opinion is what Hannah Arendt, a famous political philosopher, who actually wrote a very detailed set of articles on lies, and she's actually made a really interesting one-line thing on how you can have an opinion if you're not really informed. And opinion journalism serves to both inform people as well as let opinion go out into the world. So if you look at the problem itself, on social media in particular, you've got opinion of the general kind that all of us share. It's part of human expression. In fact, opinion is the most natural form of human expression, where we always speak when we mix facts with our opinions, feelings, and all of that. So on social media, what exists is what you call mass opinion. Everybody just shares views. Opinion in news, opinion journalism itself collides with opinion in part because you're dealing with claims of all kinds, unproven claims, hyperpartisan claims, misleading claims, deception, lies, pseudoscience, conspiracy. All of those things can come on a personalized news feed between friends and family. And on the same news feed, you're going to get articles, news articles, and you're also going to get opinion journalism of people that are being published on the news platforms that are being shared. That causes confusion to folks. It also allows people to take opinions of opinion journalists out of context and share with each other and compete. And it's a completely hyper-partisan space where this is actually ongoing. The other challenge is journalists are on social media on their own, and as part of branding and authenticity, they say things like we actually say things online, and then we may be seen to be opinionated about something, and that has implications for the news publisher. Some publishers are open to it, some publishers are not, and there have been ongoing controversies about that, as you folks already know. Now, that apart, there is a fundamental challenge just with the word controversies in journalism, and that also shows up in how opinion journalism comes out of the publishers. And one way to understand just the word controversies is to look at Daniel Hallen's work. It's there in our paper. When you get the link to the paper, you'll see that we've actually referred to it. There's a model that Daniel Hallen, who's a journalism historian, actually proposed in the 80s as part of his book on how the Vietnam War was covered. It's called Hallen's Sphere. You'll see there are concentric circles here in your screen. The actual core of the sphere is what's called the sphere of, this is what is called, consensus. That means everybody in society already agrees. Journalists actually know that. They don't think there's any controversy at all. The sun rises in the east, that's just settled. So there's nothing much to say about it. The earth goes around the sun, settled, nothing much to say about it. And then there's the sphere of legitimate controversy. And that's where the facts are not settled, the science is not settled, multiple opinions will exist, multiple perspectives and lived experiences exist. So there's chances for all of the views to actually come out. Then there's the sphere of what's called, this is deviance. And that really means just completely outside those two spheres. And that's, for example, you take the flat earth approach. So the flat earth theory is floating around even now. YouTube, if you go to social media, you'll find a lot of those kinds of posts that are anti-science, that are not rooted in what actually is. Those kinds of views exist there. Now, it's very easy to stoke controversy online when political leaders, powerful people, influencers can say whatever they want on social media, but that doesn't mean it automatically becomes a controversy. So, determining whether something is actually a legitimate issue or not, controversy or not, has become harder. And we know that journalists are inherently uncomfortable with that kind of power because you can make mistakes. It's been used to keep the opinions of marginalized people outside earlier in the name of objectivity. But it can also be used to examine whether something is really, a controversy or not. So these things become hard because if the issues are not settled in a standardized way with some standards and ethics inside publishers, it will percolate downstream to the platforms. And platforms, if they are not going to be able to sort the difference between good opinion journalism and terrible opinion journalism if it's not already sorted out at the source. So that's partly the problem. I'll just quickly go through some examples of what we found on the feeds as our panelists looked at what's happening online. If you see this Facebook news feed chart, you'll find there's a Vox article here, and this Vox article actually was not labeled as opinion on the publisher side. It actually carried opinion in it. It would have been classified if it applied the normal standards. So it did not have that label on the publisher side, and also did not have the label on the platform feed where it actually showed up. Let's take a different example. This is a New York Post article that also showed up on Facebook News. In the New York Post, this was labeled as opinion. In fact, it was opinion and sarcasm both. It was labeled. But on the Facebook News feed, it was not. It just showed up like a news article would. Now, let's take a third example. This one is where you have, if you look at the Daily Beast article, it was actually not labeled as opinion on the Beast. So the assumption there was it was positioned as news reportage. But if you look at Microsoft News's feed, this is an actual aggregator they actually labeled it as, opinion right here. So it was part of the opinion page. So this is an example of a different behavior. So you find all of these happening online at the same time. It doesn't necessarily contribute to a news experience that actually is consistent for all. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Patricia, and she's going to speak about how publishers and platforms might address it. Over to you, Patricia.
Thank you, Subbu. And welcome to all of you here. We know that our readers are confused about what distinguishes news from opinion. And you can't really blame them for this. It used to be very easy. News was in the news pages. Opinion and editorials appeared in their own section. That the wall was real. Now it's all gotten very fuzzy. And we need to, all of us, rebuild some of those distinctions to provide more clarity for our readers on what separates news from opinion. And the best way we can do that is through labeling. Each and every story ought to be labeled news or opinion. You can go through different gradations of this, but the most important one is that dual system at the top that you see, news. And then underneath that, if you have the resources, you can do breaking news, you can do explainers, you can do investigative profiles. Under opinion, you can do analysis, you could do staff opinion, commentary, perspectives. All of those things are fine, but the most essential one is news versus opinion. And let me just say a word about what is the best way to do this. We believe that you need to develop some standards within your outlet as to how you are going to distinguish news from opinion yourself. What gets which label? Someone in the newsroom or in the publishing area, the platform, has to be responsible for that. My inclination would be the writer, because I think the writer probably knows best, or the editor working above that writer, who can take responsibility for offering a brief justification, if necessary. You don't have to be prepared for this on every story, but if you're challenged by readers, you ought to be able to explain why you consider something news versus opinion. There has to be consistency in this labeling so that readers know what to expect. And for that, we're going to need to re-educate them a little bit. So we don't have separate sections anymore. But what we can have are places on our websites that explain our thinking. What basically constitutes news versus what constitutes opinion. A little bit of transparency as to how we arrive at those definitions. And, preferably a way for them to be a little interactive with this, to comment on, why a certain label was given. They may see opinion in a news story where none really exists. And that's where you need to be prepared to explain yourself, because that's the way we're going to build credibility with our readers. Right now, we've kind of turned them loose in this, limbo of this fuzzy online. Is it news? Is it opinion? We're not quite sure. We need to make those distinctions for them. And it needs to happen at the writer-publisher level, so that then when it goes out to the platforms, it's already labeled. We'd like to see some consensus, hopefully nationally and internationally even, on this kind of labeling and the basic description of what constitutes news and opinion. And I'd like to say a little bit about labeling opinion journalism in particular. So opinion journalism is in a slightly different category in that, we have some advantages that we've never had before, right? We can do rigorous fact-finding, reported out opinion, using original documents, and we can link to all of that. That was something that was hidden before, for the most part, when we did opinion. Now we can make it explicit for people. And so we really want to be able to guide readers to opinion pieces that have that rigorous fact-checking, that that use original documents, and find a way to separate that from other commentary that may or may not, it might be based on, polarizing statements or things that are less than true. All of these things wind up getting into opinion, and you don't have to agree with all of it, but we want to find a way to separate ours. Interestingly, the New York Times recently decided to drop their op-ed label on non-staff commentary and instead label those guest essays, which I guess makes it extremely clear that these are not being written by staff people. And that's one way, that's one way of separating. There could be, many ways of doing that. I think when it comes to algorithms can be great, but there is a danger for publishers of over-personalizing them. We want readers to be surprised. We want them to expand their horizons. We want them to challenge their set way of thinking. And all of those things happen when your news feed is not completely tailored to you. Predictable is boring. We want to be able to surprise people with stories that they didn't expect, both on the news side and then in opinion with things that they're going to disagree with. We do that regularly at the Star Tribune, and we get a lot of heat for it. But it's good to challenge people with different ways of thinking. And that is something that only comes when you don't have feeds that are too tailored to only, there's confirmation bias, a danger in that. The other thing we'd like to see is a top level opinion tab for all the newsfeed listings. And that is not, hopefully that won't be too difficult, but there should be a way to guide, on your news stories, to guide people to opinion that is related to that topic. I want to talk a little bit about expanded bylines. So another way that we can build credibility is through, and some outlets are already doing this, expanded bylines that can speak to the experience level of the staff writer, to their topic area, the years that they've had, either in journalism or on a specific beat. All of these things will add a little bit of credibility to what the writer has to say. And, we think that is very helpful. And I think that might be, we might be out of time. So I'd like to turn it over to some questions now.
Great. Thank you so much, Subbu and Patricia, for walking us through the paper. I just want to invite the audience to ask any questions that you might have in terms of just clarification of the presentation. But we also wanted to pose another question to you as the audience, which is, if you could frame your own question for how you think, what are the questions that you think that we as a community need to be asking in order to move recommendations forward like this one? Should you agree that news and opinion, that it's really important to keep divided? So we look forward to those questions from the audience. Yeah, both. So let me just go ahead and maybe just open it up then to some of the ones that we're hearing. One audience member asked, I think the bigger problem is that there is insufficient public distinction between actual news and opinion outlets and extremist propaganda or non-fact-based opinion outlets like Fox News, Newsmax, etc. So how can we do that better? And where then do we put the CNN, MSNBC primetime hosts? Which do either of you want to bite first?
Well, I'll just say I'm not sure that we can do the labeling for those outlets. It's not like there's some international rules about what constitutes news versus opinion. This is something where, at first, we're going to have to rely on outlets to do it themselves. As for organizations like Newsmax, it would be great, if we could police that sort of thing, but we just can't. Part of that is the freedom of the press. I do think, hopefully the outlets that do decide to do this will gain greater credibility and trust with their readers. And that's how you're going to build it, brick by brick, by reliably labeling pieces, news, or opinion. You can only do what you generate, right, or what you decide to publish. We don't yet have a mechanism for determining what another outlet publishes and whether or not they decide to observe those distinctions. But, the more we build these definitions, the more readers come to expect them. Hopefully they will be wary of pieces that are not labeled.
Terrific.
Can I jump in on
Subbu,
that?
do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I feel that this is an important question, and I'm glad it's been asked. It's upstream of the opinion panel itself. We looked at opinion journalism coming out of news publishers, and I think this audience member is absolutely on the ball. This comes to the level of what is journalism itself and what is news, and that's been the cultural problem where definitions get fought over. Ideally, if the people who are practicing responsible journalism can all push up the reputation of journalism because of the responsible practice, because of the education around what it is, then it's easier to fight back and create boundaries around people who are not doing journalism at all. Those who don't and yet claim to be doing news. So that boundary is not clearly established because in culture, speech is part of culture, news is part of culture, the occupation of journalism arises in culture, and that makes it hard for how to set the boundaries so that people who are basically doing garbage or doing conspiracy or doing non-factual commentary, all of them get actually accounted for in the media ecosystem. I think the platforms have a greater responsibility here than even mainline, news publishers or new local news publishers, in part because the platforms have to make a decision on how they're going to separate, and that has to do with what I call journalistic behavior. They have to be able to understand what is journalistic behavior and what is not, and it's not an easy problem. So, yeah.
Perfect. So we have lots of comments from the audience, so I'm going to start kind of going a little quicker and maybe just pick one of you to answer. But I think one of the things that your presentation did, in terms of just highlighting the complexity of the problem, was to point out, obviously, that there's potentially a lot of work that needs to be done both on the platform side, but also on the journalism side equally. So this first question, I just want to quickly direct to Subbu, and then related to platforms, and then to address another question related to a journalism perspective to Patricia. The first one, in terms of platforms, Biladar asks, how can we get the platforms to incentivize this? I mean, there's been talk about this for years, and sadly, nothing has happened. So, Subbu, do you have any quick thoughts related to that?
Is the question about, how can we get the platforms to implement labeling?
We'll just say incentivize separation.
So let me give some context on what I know the platforms have actually attempted to do. There is a registration system that, for example, Facebook uses for organizations that are doing news to actually register as news organizations. Google News does the same thing as well. So there already is a way for social media companies to ask for organizations to register themselves. So at that point, there is some leverage for publishers and platforms to work together to use the same set of standards. So it's not that the incentives aren't there. The organizational connections in the partnership ecosystem between the platforms and the publishers are there in every country. What's not there is how do you go beyond a simple claim that I'm a news organization and I'm registering with my site and all of that, and from what standards are we actually using? That incentivization has to happen both for the public, and I think each side wants the other to do something first. I would like both sides to sit together and actually hammer out a consensus of what Patricia just said, minimal basic labeling, news versus opinion, and then go from there, and not just for the US, but every country.
Mm-hmm. And then a question for Patricia. I'm going to glom a couple of them together. One question asks, what would be your criteria to set recommendations to separate opinion from propaganda? Another one notices that there's a lot of opinionated words in hard news stories like the New York Times and Washington Post. So one of maybe the larger questions, do you think maybe journalists need to be re-educated overall, potentially on words and categories when it comes to journalism?
In short, yes. I don't think that would hurt at all. There's been a little, shall we say, sloppiness lately, in terms of using loaded language, opinionated language, and I'm hopeful that the mere discipline imposed by having to select a label of one versus the other will bring writers back to using more neutral language in news stories and reserving more persuasion language for opinion pieces. That is a boundary that needs to be reestablished. And some of it, is more subtle than others, but if we could at least remove the most overt language, I think that would be progress. And I'm sorry, what was the other part of your question?
No, it's just really that maybe that open in terms of like re-education related to language or even genre potentially, right? Like in terms of, the genre, the form itself, maybe knowing that line between what is opinion versus maybe something like propaganda.
Yeah, the opinion versus propaganda. I mean, one thing we can do is, in terms of our outlet, we control what we publish, right? So you don't have to publish pieces that are outright propaganda that rely on deception and lies and misleading claims. We can decide not to publish pieces like that. They are coming in from outside, presumably. So maybe a little tighter rein on some of that. Would there ever be a propaganda label? That would be self-defeating. I don't see anybody ever doing that. So it's going to depend a little bit on the criteria that these news outlets establish. There can be standards for opinion as well. I mean, not just news, but what constitutes, opinion that we are willing to publish, I guess would be the best way to put it.
Mm-hmm. So then, actually, this is a related question to both of you, perhaps from your experience, like reviewing the feeds during the panel. And noting this language, right, that there can be opinionated language and perhaps like AI or crowdsourcing might be able to help in terms of recognizing what's opinion or what's strictly fact-based reporting. But taking a step back from your perspective on the panel, what kind of hope would you place in that? Is there any hope that you would want to place in that kind of solution? Or is this, again, maybe as you were just saying, Patricia, something much more that fundamentally it is about the approach and perspective of the author as an opinion journalist needing to say, like, this is what I'm doing and this is the label I'm going to put it under.
Yeah, and you need to be able to justify your actions. And I think that's probably the best discipline of all. When I was a political editor, I used to tell my reporters, you can write things, but you need to be prepared to defend them. And I think as opinion journalists, we have to do the same thing. We have to be prepared to defend our decisions about language, about context, and in this case, it would be about the label itself. A friend of mine used to call himself the licensed journalist. It was a column that he had. And of course, the joke was there is no license that you need to be a journalist. Right? We all self-police a little bit, and some of us do it, a little more rigorously than others.
Can I jump in on that, Connie? Mm-hmm. I think AI is a very problematic space for human expression, just because of how AI works. People in AI often want lots and lots of labeled articles to first learn, for the machines to learn what is opinion and not. So unless publishers first systematically label across the board, machines are going to be hard pressed to learn. Machines can tell the difference between the actual tonality, sentiment, opinionated language, and so on. But there's speech and expression in text of articles that's different from journalistic opinion journalism, where you actually have quotes. You can quote people. Inside the quotes, you can have opinion, but outside the quotes, you're reporting. The fact. These are things. For AI to understand that, it has to go upstream of a page of text into the journalistic practice on that text. And historically, platforms have not been that interested in going upstream from the page into the actual practice. So I would still prefer to go with what Patricia is saying and what we've said, which is start the labeling at the publisher side consistently first before accepting any claims from the AI side on the platform that it can even work. But I think if the two sides work together and set up training infrastructure for machines to learn, there's a chance that you can automate some of it in terms of detection.
Here's one thing that I wouldn't mind seeing platforms do this, is to give priority to pieces that are labeled, and that would create an incentive to do the labeling, so that you would rank a little bit higher in terms of publishing priority.
So this is a great segue to another question from the audience, is in terms of that practicality, which actually I've been pausing on this one because I have to think about this. Then would one, as a news outlet, validate oneself in a way as a news outlet first before positioning yourself in terms of having an opinion section? In other words, does one, practically speaking, as an outlet, need to establish a certain kind of credibility in terms of its news offerings that are non-opinion journalism, as well as having opinion journalism? Does that question sort of make sense? Maybe I'll put it to Subbu first.
So we had this challenge in Bangalore for both my publications that I ran. And this is actually a really good question because it tells you what a news organization really is like. Unless a news organization has some original reportage that's coming out, because its reporters are on the ground doing reporting, they travel, they check things out and do actual stories, interviewing people and so on, that leads to discovery of what's happening. If then on the as a separate plank, you can do the opinion journalism part. If a site comes up tomorrow that says I'm a news site and it's only carrying commentary, that to me is a signal that it's a problem. I would say the platforms have to see that and take note of that, because that's not you can't just claim to be a news organization, in my opinion, if you're doing only commentary. I'd like to see news organizations do both. There may be organizations that do only reportage because of their model or investigation, and they'll say we'll just offer it to other news organizations and we're not doing opinion. That might happen, but the opposite, I think, is actually a problem, particularly in our current ecosystem. But let's see what Patricia has to say about that.
I think you put it very well, Subbu. I have nothing to add on that one.
So here's another tricky sort of conundrum to think about. Obviously, a number of journalists are not only publishing on their outlets, but they also make their own opinions known via social media. This is an interesting question. Then should a journalist potentially use some kind of label when they're interacting in social media in terms of when they're writing an opinion, and another when they're actually trying to state something as a fact-based piece of information?
Well, Twitter in particular, I think doesn't really lend itself to that kind of formality. And I do see a lot of opinion from news reporters. And, again, some of this is going to come back to discipline and professionalism. I think if you're a news reporter, as tempting as it may be to weigh in on issues of the day, you risk your credibility when you do that, and you tip your hand a little bit. And I'm old school enough that I'm not comfortable with that. I kept opinions strictly out of my social media contributions until I joined the editorial board, and now it's now I can let it rip, right? I still get a lot of responses from readers who remember back to my reporting and editor days, and they're confused as to why now I have opinions. And I tell them, well, now I'm paid to have opinions, so I'm going to express them. This is something that reporters are going to have to do for themselves. I would hope that they would become reacquainted with the fact that you don't have to weigh in on every topic that you're reporting on, and that there is some value in maintaining some neutrality.
Subbu, any thoughts?
I feel there's a range of options for journalists to take on social media. and it has to be nuanced based on understanding of what social media is. And it's fundamentally different from everything else. They are expression platforms. They're platforms to express your thoughts, feelings, emotion, and things tend to trend faster if there's opinion in them. It's just how these platforms have designed themselves intentionally for their business model. So when reporters are expressing themselves, I think we've got to go up the level between opinion and reporting into values. As long as reporters are open about their values and not trying to hide their values. If I am pro-democracy as a value and I'm anti-insurrection, because of that, I can be open about it and stand my ground on it. So I stand for democracy too. So the problem comes when we assume that the public is not intelligent, or we assume the public can't, a part of the public that has a different value system than us tends to read what we say as opinion, even though we may be saying it factually. So it's the value system conflict where most disagreements come. So as long as reporters, journalists on social media are open about their values and what they stand for, because people like that. People like transparency also at the value level, not just how I got to the facts. Then it may be possible to express yourself, but then that becomes like a settlement between what reporters have to have with their publishers internally, because otherwise that leads to all kinds of other controversies, as you folks would know. I don't think this matter is settled, but I think we've got to move forward beyond either cancel culture or just completely saying reporters don't talk on social media at all.
So I feel like one of the things that we're doing when we talk about potentially what kinds of transformation might need to happen in both journalism and the platforms is sort of like, you know, the transformation of opinion journalism, perhaps, right, as it engages now in this new space. And so one question, noting Patricia's nod to the New York Times recent announcement about retiring the op-ed is an interesting question. So this change to titling it guest essays, I guess a question for you both in terms of thinking about now and the future of opinion journalism. For example, do you predict that this might change, or other publications might follow in their footsteps? Is this something that betokens something larger related to the future of opinion journalism? Thoughts from you both in terms of that?
Well,
you go first, Patricia.
we certainly could do that. At the Star Tribune, we've chosen to use labels, such as commentary or perspective rather than guest essay. But we do believe that there should be a way to separate staff commentary from non-staff commentary, because there are different levels, frankly, of rigor and fact-finding and evidence base that we use for our own pieces, as opposed to those that come from outside.
What's interesting I found about the New York Times announcement this week, I think it came out on Monday or Tuesday, and I'm like, wow, we have this panel, so this is going to come up, is the word op-ed has a history that the public doesn't understand or know, or publishers haven't assumed the importance of actually explaining all of that. So the opinions editor of the New York Times explained the history of that word op-ed in a useful way. I wish that was done when the op-ed was invented and kept that way, but it wasn't. So it merely says it was opposite the editorial page, and it's external opinions, columns and so on. So while they may be retiring that term itself, I don't think they're retiring opinion journalism. So it's a technical thing. And as long as they're labeling their articles, as long as platforms can tell that this is a New York Times opinion journalism piece versus this is a reportage piece, the fundamental practice is still the same. So if other publishers want to retire the op-ed term because it's not really standing its ground in today's chaotic media environment without explanation, it's one less headache for people to worry about at the very least.
I'm going to pause here actually to, you may remember that we we put a poll at the beginning of the session. So we were thinking about rerunning it, but in fact, there's actually quite strong consensus on this poll. So I thought I'd just read out some of the responses and then just find it interesting for us all to share. So the first question we asked the audience was, should all articles that carry persuasion be labeled opinion? And of those who answered, 72% of them said yes. 19% said no, actually, and then 13% said this is impossible. So I'm going to ask you to hold that one in mind for a second, because I think I'd like to come back to that one. The second question we asked of the audience was, do you believe that news readers appreciate the separation of news from opinion? And then in this case, in fact, 91% of the audience said yes, they do believe that readers appreciate that separation. The third question, do you believe opinion journalism is different from any opinion online? And in this case, 81% of the audience agreed, yes. They feel like it is different, or believe that it's different. And then finally, in terms of kind of our strongest response, do you agree that more clearly labeling news and opinion would help improve the overall quality of news online? At the time the poll was taken, we got 100% yes. So hopefully that sort of can reflect back to us all as a group, as interactive as we're able to be, that there is a strong feeling here that some separation really would be improving the overall quality of our news experience. But I just want to come back to this original, the first question in the poll, which did have this response from folks in the audience who are like, this is impossible that all articles that carry persuasion be labeled opinion. And I wondered maybe if you had any thoughts you wanted to share with that, or maybe let me ask it in another way, kind of categorically speaking. We know of the category of analysis, and why analysis may be very hard to sort of think through, like, is that opinion or is that news journalism? And so just wanting to kind of, say, like, practically speaking, is it in fact, are there these cases where, this is just really just can't be done? And maybe Subbu first.
So the way I start with that is that I'm not embarrassed about having to label something as opinion if I was an editor. It's actually a good thing to call something that's got persuasion in it opinion, because you go out officially and say that opinion journalism, people seek it out, people are sometimes looking for opinion, they track an author and they actually find it. It makes it easier for persuasion to be found, because I'm like, persuade me, why is this policy better than something else? So we shouldn't actually hesitate to have a standard that identifies persuasion and says, call this opinion. As long as it's opinion, journalism, fact-based, evidence-based, accounts for lived experiences of people, it's good. What I worry about is attempting to do that in AI, to starting to get into definitional battles about what is what actually is persuasion or not. Those are tricky issues, but I think editors and reporters in any news organization, they can tell the difference between what's persuasion and what's not, because they are already good at language. So I don't see a problem in that, as long as there's an agreement to actually have a standard and just implement it. What do you think, Patricia?
I think there's a lot of difficulty in using the word persuasion. So at what point am I informing, educating, and when does that slip over into persuasion? Because it's a spectrum, right? It's not an either or. Someone's article that informs to one person, another person could easily read that as an attempt to, indoctrinate or, to persuade. This is why this is going to be a process, right? And part of the discipline will come in trying to figure this out on these stories. Can I defend this as a news piece? Or does it do so much to persuade that it needs to slip over into the opinion label? That is going to be the challenge. And I'm not trying to diminish that. There's going to need to be some real soul searching. Some reporters are going to have to maybe take a little bit of language out, or something that might just stray a little too far into opinion. It's not a black or white thing. This is something that we're going to have to wrestle with, and it's the doing of it that is going to, and being challenged on it by readers over and over again, that is going to help us refine this process.
Do you think, just as one more final question from the audience, because I see that we're almost at time, is there, from the technical perspective or the journalist perspective, do you guys have your favorite guides for differentiating between news versus opinionated language? In other words, like, does this, just as what you were speaking, mentioning, Patricia, that this is going to be hard work, that we have to figure out how to approach this. Maybe this is another thing for the agenda in terms of looking to the future. How can we sort of share resources or think about, again, like, what does it mean to be, sort of writing opinion journalism and writing news journalism in an online space? Moving forward.
Yeah, I think that actually would be a good topic for us to get together on in the future and maybe tackle that specific point. What are the, to develop a guide to separating news from opinion?
So one starting point for that I've had to use in the past is people who are writing opinion, they take a position and they're open about taking a position, and they justify why that position, either against a policy, for a policy, or against even a person running for office, or all of that. There's usually, you can tell from the language that there's justificational language towards an outcome or actually against it. Whereas in reportage, you will not have that kind of flow. You'll not have that setup. You'll not have that sense of reason and argument in it at all. You simply have the hourglass. You'll have some form of saying, this happened, and here's what different people are saying. Here's the experiences of these people. And there are different forms of reporting there. So it's not just one form of reporting. But usually you can tell there's a justificational flow, and that's a useful place to start. But I think I agree with what Patricia said even earlier. Unless this is done over and over again in a consistent way, it's in the doing of it that we'll build a new practice of separation, a new practice of actual identification and education. If we don't even start, we will just be talking about this 10 years later.
Terrific. Well, I just want to, on that note, invite, first, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your experiences on our panel last year. Really want to invite the audience that if you're interested in continuing to collaborate or to kind of continue the conversation about how to advance the division of news and opinion, number one, on the NewsQ project, we're launching our second panel into news and opinion. You can see that announced on that site, where we really want to dive in deeper this year with a lot of lovely folks, some of whom are also presenting on other panels during this during ISOJ. So we really do invite your continued participation. If you're interested in this topic, feel free to reach out to us at hello@newsq.net. Yeah, in the meantime, we'll just look forward to trying to push this conversation forward among us all. So really, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Connie. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Patricia.
Wow, thank you so much, everyone. This was a really great conversation, and I know people must have learned a lot from it. I love all the tips and takeaways you shared. So thank you so much for being here with us today. Really appreciate it.
Actually, thank you, Mallory. I didn't know you were Mallory because I missed something in the introduction, so I'm glad I found out that you were Mallory. Thank you.
Yes, it is me. Thank you.
Do you have a sense of how many people?
We are still actually live, so I have to wrap up with a few announcements, but we will share those numbers after. I think this session was well attended, though, and I think that there's going to be a lot of people who will want to re-watch it after the fact. So just as a reminder to everyone in the audience, we will have this session available on our YouTube page in English and in Spanish. And so we'll be sharing that out so that you can view a recording of the session. So up next, we have about a 30-minute break or so until our next panel at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. And the panel is titled Race and Equity in the News, Reporting in Service of Communities, and with the URL, Uplift, Respect, and Love Lens. And it's going to feature a really strong lineup of 5 speakers who you're going to learn a lot from. So we hope that you will join us for that panel. And in the meantime, we hope that you'll check out our Wonder Room, where you can interact with other iSaggers and speakers. So we will put a link to that Wonder Room chat in the Zoom chat so you can easily access it right after this session ends. And we also encourage you to check out the Pick and Post page on isoj.org, where you can download fun ISOJ graphics and share them on social media using the hashtag ISOJ2021. So we'll pop a link to that pick and post page in our chat as well. So with that, I'm going to wrap up, and I look forward to seeing you back here again in about 30 minutes. See you soon.